very much alike.
Remember all the happy times we had?
Very much alike. All right. I'll tell you the truth.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class this afternoon. Thanks for watching. Thanks for joining me as we get started today. Just a couple of announcements. I am in the process of grading the things that were turned in this past week for Module 2. We are moving right along to Module 3, right? Like it's hard to believe that like the semester is going so quickly, right? Like things just seemed like they were getting started, but at this point they're, approaching the midway point for a lot of classes. Within the next couple of weeks we'll be, around the middle of October, we'll be in the middle of the semester. So we're getting really, really close to being halfway done and on the downhill slope, which is pretty great. So I'll be grading the stuff that was turned in for the previous module within the next day or two. I'm going to try to grade a lot of it today. If you have any questions about that, if you have any questions about anything, please reach out to me. Send me a Teams message, send me an email, whatever you need to do to get in touch with me. And I will hopefully clarify everything that needs to be clarified for you. But we are moving on today. We're moving on into Module 3, and I'd like to focus my little workshop today here in the live stream on what I think to be one of the more significant topics of essentially everything that we're doing here, and that's affordances, signifiers, and feedback. So you got a little bit of an introduction to affordances, signifiers, and feedback in your reading, in your Design of Everyday Things book. And it talks about how affordances, signifiers, and feedback really impact how we interact with products. And really what we're talking about here is we're talking about interaction design and how we interact with things, and what else do we do with a website except for interact with it. So these ideas of affordances, of signifiers, of feedback really become exceptionally important as we are working with websites and designing websites, right? We are trying to design this good interaction that we've talked about over the last couple of weeks, right? We're trying to solve problems within constraints. We're trying to take our user and guide them through a proper user experience that will create for them an environment in which a good experience can be possible. And one of the biggest ways, one of the easiest ways we can do that is by providing affordances, by providing signifiers, and providing feedback to our users. Essentially what we're doing here is we're creating this foundation, we're creating this groundwork for good interaction design. So we're looking at these foundations of interaction, And they are affordances, signifiers, and feedbacks, as we previously mentioned. But this is a good time to point out what exactly these functions are, or what exactly these functions relate to. Affordances and signifiers relate to user input. Right? What are the actions that our users are taking? What can help them make these actions? So in preparation for an action, how are we guiding our user to do the correct action? And we do that with affordances and signifiers. And in turn, once they've done the once they've done the action via the pathway that we've given them, utilizing affordances and signifiers, then at that point they get feedback. Right? And it's this feedback that tells them, yes, you did correct, or no, you didn't do correct. You need to try something else. Right? So our affordances and signifiers are guiding them in the right direction to do something correct. And our feedback is that output. It's that affirmation that something correct has occurred. So let's break these down. Let's look at each of these foundations of interaction here and discuss them just a little further. So what are affordances? An affordance is what something looks like it does. What does it look like it does? And, this is something that we kind of have this innate ability to kind of do. Like in your module, you have some material that talks about Norman doors, right? And Norman doors are Norman doors because the affordances do not match the proper action of the door. The affordances do not match the way you actually interact with the door. And when we're thinking about Norman doors as well, we think about it in relation to the affordance actually being at conflict, at odds with the signifier as well. But when you see a door, right, let's just imagine ourselves a door here. Let's, let's draw ourselves some doors. When we see a door, let's imagine that's a nice door there. It's not, but let's pretend. Right, and our door has a handle. Versus a door that has one of those bars that runs crossways. Maybe with one of these locking mechanism bad boys that you see. Right? We're used to seeing these two general types of doors, right? A door that has a handle there versus a door that has, this push bar, right? And so when we're using this handle, and we can even kind of think of it as being like, when we're using this handle and we see this handle and it has that, the handle shape to it like that, we get this inclination that we're supposed to take our hand, right? Because that's the place where our hand fits. We're supposed to take our hand, wrap it around that handle, and then the option would be to move our arm backward, right? Like when we're looking at a door with that kind of handle, the inclination, the affordance, if you will, is that we're supposed to pull open that door. And then when we're looking at this other door here, our second door with the bar that runs horizontal across it, there's no place to put your hand to grab, right? But you have this wide berth there where you can take both hands and push forward. So these doors give us this inclination being what we call an affordance. It gives us the affordance of being able to operate in one way or another. Another good example here is the mug that we have there, right? Have you ever thought about the fact that nobody's ever taught you how to use a mug? You just pretty much know innately how to use a mug, right? You know that you have this handle there. The handle gives you the affordance. You know, that looks like where your hand probably should go. Right? If it has a small hole, you might just wrap 2 or 3 fingers through there. If it's a full-sized handle there, you can wrap your whole hand around it. And then you've got the big open area in the top that's contained on the bottom, and that's the place where you put the liquid. Like, it's just intuitive. Right? The mug itself is full of affordances. Nobody's ever taught you how to use a mug, and you don't have to have instructions for how to use a mug. It's just simple. Right, so now let's take this idea of affordances and take it into the web design world, because we can do that. We can do that quite easily, right? Because there's a reason why when we're working with this, we have some sort of text. So we have text on our website. And we tell people in general not to use underlines to call out text emphasis. Instead, use the emphasis tag, the EM tag for italics, or bold it. Right? We tell people not to use underlines. We tell people not to use underlines for text decoration in general. Why is that? You know, we have this idea of this knowledge in the head versus knowledge in the world, which we'll discuss more a little later on. Right? And we have this knowledge that when text is underlined, that means it's a link. And as such, I should be able to click on that text and it should be able to take me somewhere else. But if I see text that is underlined on a website, even if that gives me the affordance of being clickable, and then I go to click it and nothing happens, right? Because that's possible for you to be able to do. All of a sudden, I'm confused. Right? I know that if there's a blue line there, that's the affordance that's supposed to be clickable. Conversely, another affordance that we get is with your cursor. Right, we understand that your cursor in general, when it's in that little pointy shape, right, that's just the standard cursor, or we might even see it in that shape that we use for highlighting. Right, and we know that when we use the pointy finger, that pointy finger, that usually means that something is clickable. Right, when we have that little finger point hand there. But it's possible for us to make something that is clickable on a website that doesn't look like it's clickable. Because we change the cursor to something that is different when they roll over it, or we change the cursor, or we don't change the cursor at all for something that we've done special with, like JavaScript or something like that. So even though it is clickable, it doesn't look like it's clickable. And so that's why we change the cursor, to give that affordance that, oh, you've rolled over something that you can click. Another thing that gives us good affordances are buttons. Right? Because our buttons that we add to websites, they look like that for a reason. Right? They look like they're slightly 3D. Like they're standing off of the page a little bit. And this is to create that connotation in your mind with a real life button. Right? With a button that you might have on a phone or on your video game controller or what have you. You know, it kind of has that similar look there. And so when you see that, you know, oh, if I click on that, then that's there to be clicked on, right? Like something that's there for something to happen to it. Like when I click on it, it depresses and it goes down flat into the page visually, right? Not actually, because it's all 2D. But it visually goes down flat into the page, and that's giving you some feedback, actually, that, you're supposed to, you get this indicator, this affordance, that you're supposed to click on this button because it looks like a button in the real world that you would know that you would need to press in order for something to happen. And then when you press it, it actually moves. And when it moves down, or when it changes state in some way, you get this indication that, oh, I did something right. And that's partially what feedback is. Right? So the big thing is that our affordances match our intentions. And this is something that is easy to do. Right? We just want to make sure that what we're doing is conducive with what we want our user to do. But it's also easy to mess this up. Because as we've mentioned here, there are several examples that we've discussed here where our user just completely has no idea what's going on because somebody wanted to be maybe a little too fancy or didn't consider how the interaction looked. Right, so that's pretty critical. We want to give these visual cues for our user to do something when we want our user to do something. Now, it's also true that not in every case will we be able to do that. Will we be able to give these visual clues? Right? In these cases, we need signifiers. And these signifiers are what something is labeled as doing. What something is labeled as doing. So again, you want what you have labeled there to match what the user does or what this element does. Right? And we go back to our concept of the Norman doors, right? Let's look at those Norman doors again. We have the door. And oftentimes when we're dealing with these Norman doors, we'll have the door, we'll have the handle, and we also might have a label on our door to operate as a signifier here. And this is an important thing for us to understand as people who are creating interactions. When we have this disconnect between our affordances and our signifiers. When you approach a door that is a Norman door, that has this disconnect, that does the opposite of what it looks like it would do, what do you notice first? Do you notice the affordance, or do you notice the signifier? And I've seen people do it time and time again with Norman doors where they walk up to the door is clearly labeled push or pull, right? But the handle is opposite of what it should be for that sort of situation. Or isn't conducive to the push or pull nature of the door, and they attempt to open the door the way they think they should open it. And they are immediately met with a thud, or they do that wild swing where they were trying to push it at first, but then realized, oh, it doesn't push, and pull it back. But their amount of effort that they were putting in just causes them to just rip it open, right? And so that's what we see here. our users gravitate toward what they see first. When our users are starting to assess what they need to do, it's just like when somebody is trying to assess how they want to open a door, right? Like you're going to start making that assessment 10, 15 feet back, right? You're like, oh, I see the handle. I know how to open this door. I'm just going to walk up, pull it open or push it open, whatever. So while we're still far away, while we're not deep into what we're looking at on a web page, we start to make conclusions about the actions we need to take. We start drawing these conclusions. And it's only after we hit a couple incorrect conclusions that we change and we start to read our signifiers. Read those labels. So we want to make sure that we have both good affordances and good signifiers present for our user to understand the process. Right? One of the things we've said before, one of the things we'll say time and time again, is that if you're doing things right, your users won't have any idea that you're doing things at all. And when your user is approaching the website, one of the things they want to do is they want to just be able to use the website. They don't want to have to think about how I need to use this website. They don't want to think about the actions that they need to take. They just want to be able to get in there and do it. Because remember, one of the big things that we're discussing here is this idea that, when people are using our websites, they have a goal in mind. Right? When we're designing websites, we're starting by focusing in on that problem of what these users' goals are, what these users want to do. And the whole crux of our design is being able to create a website that facilitates the solution to that problem in the easiest way possible. So when we are making these interfaces, when we make things that people want and need to click on, we have to make sure that we're adding appropriate affordances and signifiers. So those are our inputs, right? Those are the things that guide our user input, that get our user to try to do the right thing. But once our user does a thing, what do we have next? Well, that's the job of the affordance, or that's the job of the feedback, rather. That's the job of the feedback. The feedback is that response after the input. When you push the button, it actually pushes down. So you get that feedback. That's the reason why, on a lot of phones, they introduce that tactical response, right? Where you get that little buzz, you get that little motion where it feels like you've actually pressed a button even though you've only tapped a screen, right? It's giving you that feedback, letting you know that you performed an action. You did something. And our feedback can really come in the form of a different set of affordances and signifiers, right? A different set of non-textual and textual context. That's a weird sentence. Non-textual and textual feedback. You can have things pop up red. You can have things kind of shake no. You can have things just kind of reset, and all of these are feedback actions for a wrong entry. But you could also have words pop up that's saying, oh, sorry, this was not correct. You forgot to add your state, which is a requirement, or you forgot to do this, which is a requirement. And again, just like with our affordances and signifiers to denote our inputs, this textual and non-textual feedback is also important. And just think about it from the perspective of a user. You click a link, you click a button, and then just nothing happens. Maybe it did the thing you wanted to do, like maybe it submitted your form and it didn't do anything with it, or maybe it didn't work at all. The question then is, how do you know? How do you know if it worked? How do you know if it didn't work? So you want to reset that form, maybe. Like if you're working with a form, maybe you want to reset the form. Clear out all the form fields. Maybe you want to, pop up a little message there that says, oh, your message has been submitted. Thank you. That way you're getting some textual and non-textual feedback that the action that you wanted to do or the action that you thought you performed was actually performed. So now let's bring the concept of feedback into our idea of Norman doors here. Because really, all three of our affordances, our signifiers, and our feedback can be found in a Norman door. Right, and I actually have a nice picture of a Norman door here, where we have those handles, like we mentioned earlier. One that looks like, oh, I can take my hand and I can wrap it around this, which is going to facilitate a pull. Right, that's our visual here. But then we see our signifier here that's labeled as push. Right, so our affordances here are giving us big pull vibes, and our signifiers are telling us to push. So what's our feedback in these instances? The feedback tells us what we did wrong or what we did right. So in the case of a door, it's the opening or lack thereof of the door that gives us that feedback. Right, if I take that handle and I pull it and nothing happens, that's feedback. Maybe I'm met with that little shudder that you get, right? When you try to open a door that's locked, or when you try to open a door the wrong way. You get that little thud and you get that little shake. That's feedback. And we can also see here that it doesn't look like there's a lock on these doors. Right? These doors don't have an affordance for locking. We don't see any latches between our handles here. We don't see any visual sign of these doors being able to lock. So that feedback, that negative feedback that we get when we get that thud and that shudder and the door doesn't open, makes us think, well, maybe we tried to open the door wrong. And that's when we realize, oh, the signifier says push. So we need to push this open. Right, and when we push it open and when we perform the right action, our problem state of not being in the room where we want to be is solved by the door opening. Right? That's the core idea of the design here. So we can really take these doors and break them down really deeply into ideas of web design, right? Because we can talk about the problem being, well, we need to separate people from being allowed in this room without actually, but also giving them the opportunity to come in circumstances. So we put this door on hinges that can swing open and closed. And so, if they don't need to be in there, the door can be closed and the people who are in the other room can have privacy or be able to do what they need to do. You just have that separation between one room and the next. And if they do need to be in there, Well, we have these affordances here that the door can be opened via either a push or a pull. And to back that up, we provide them with a signifier, just in case it's not completely clear. And especially in cases like what we have here, it's not completely clear. And so if they need to be in that room and they're kept apart from that room by this door and they're able to open the door and get in, that's their feedback, with the understanding that the action they performed was correct to be able to do what they need to do, i.e. get in that room. So how do we relate all this? Right, how do we relate all this to the idea of the web? And we've already talked about a bunch of it. Buttons, UI elements, navigation. You know, when we think about links and we think about buttons and we think about forms and all this sort of stuff, it's directly relational to what we need to be doing with our affordances, with our signifiers, with our feedback. Now, when we look at that in relation to our visual elements, let's just have a look at this here, right? Like, we see all of these different visual elements, and we see in all of these elements exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about affordances, when we're talking about signifiers, when we're talking about feedback. Right? Like, look at all these buttons that we have here, right? Even though they've been redesigned from the default button, they still have a little bit of 3D to them, right? They still look like they're standing off of the page just a little bit. Like, if we look here in the upper right-hand corner at all these get the app buttons, right? Let's zoom in there. You can see there's a little subtle gradient on these that give them a little three-dimensionality. There's a little border around them to make them look like, well, maybe I could press this and it would go down. Right, and so these give you the indication. And these buttons especially are great examples of affordances and signifiers. Right, because my affordance itself is how we've designed the button. Right, it has this 3D look. You know, it has the little border where it looks like it could actually be, you know, there's actually more beneath it and it can be pressed down. It gives us this visual. But it also has a signifier on it, and that signifier is what we have in the label there. Get the app. So we know if we click on this button, we have this indication of what's going to happen. So if we want to click this button, we want to click this button in order to get the app. So what would our feedback be in these cases? Maybe the app starts to download. Maybe it takes us to another page where we can download it, like from a software store. Right, and we see affordances and signifiers here as well in these little buttons. Right, like these signifiers might not be as clear, but we still have signifiers here. These little icons count as signifiers, right? They're the labels that give us an indication of what we're supposed to do with these buttons. We still have the same kind of button set up here, where we have the little gradient and the border, and with the idea that, you know, we can click this and bring it down and have something happen here. But we also have these little icons that go along with it, and these icons rely heavily on knowledge in the head and knowledge in the world to be able to communicate the signifiers to the user. Right? But that's another topic for another day. Right? But we see icons like heart and star, and those are often used for like favorites. Right? We see a pencil icon that's often used for editing, a check mark and an X icon that are used for like approve or deny. The letter icon that we use for email, the two arrows going around that we use for refresh. the screwdriver and the wrench that we use oftentimes for like preferences or settings. You know, all of these things are giving us signifiers as to what happens if we click on this button. Now, these definitely aren't as clear as our textual based or our pure textual based, because it technically is kind of textual. But that's another thing for another day. Buttons that we have here. Like, it's clear that when we click that button, we'll have something that allows us to get the app. But then we also look at other elements here, like scroll bars. Right, scroll bar, having a scroll bar on the side of your page is an indication that there's more. It's an affordance that there's more than just what you're looking at. And you say, well, Mr. Ramsey, that's not a big deal, right? You know, it puts the scroll bars in automatically. Well, it does put the scroll bars in automatically, but you can also take the scroll bars out. You can tell it not to scroll. And I've seen that happen before, where people remove the scroll bars from their website simply because they don't think they look good. When this is an important signifier, or rather an important affordance on their website, that there's more than just what they see. Like, you can still use your scroll wheel on your mouse to get down, or you can still do the thing where you highlight and drag and it takes you down the page. But just the knowledge that there's more stuff down there is a bigger deal. Let's take a look around here, see some more stuff. Here we have some really good feedback. Like, we see examples of feedback here in this table and here in these messages. Right, and we're seeing examples of feedback that are both text-based and visual. Right, because we can't just rely in this instance on a visual. Right, like one of the things here, when we look at these error messages and these warning messages here, we see this blue and red and green and yellow messages. Now, all the messages are different, which is good, right? We get that textual component of our feedback. But what if we didn't have a textual component to our feedback? And you just saw red for bad or green for good. What happens? Right, well, I mean, what you end up with there is the fact that you're losing out on clients due to accessibility. Right? Think about color blindness. If the only feedback that they get is a visual color based on whether they performed the correct or incorrect action, and one is red and one is green, then you don't have good feedback there. Like, we can examine that, right? Because I've got both red and green markers on this whiteboard thing here. So one of the things that I see done, and we all see done a lot, is people use something like this to give an indication of whether something is good or bad. Right? You have a red square or a green square, which color blindness, they're both essentially the same color, right? It's hard to tell which one's good and which one's bad. And I've actually seen this out in the wild. I saw this just recently. You know, one of the programs that I use to do the live streaming with, based on your stream health, it shows you either a red square, a yellow square, or a green square. And you don't get any other kind of feedback unless you hover over that square to figure out what's going on. But what if we took this and we made one simple change? What if we took this and made this a green check mark and a red X? So now not only do we have this visual key that we have in these colors, that we have red and green, red for bad and green for good, we also have another cue, X for bad and check for good. So even if you were colorblind and you couldn't experience half of that feedback, you would be able to experience the other half. Now we could get into a little bit deeper here. Like I think the X and check are great in this instance because it's pretty much culturally universal. However, some of these symbols that are used lack cultural relevance, so it's harder to use them for signifiers or for feedback. Right? Because like if you think about the old phone handset that's still used widely for a call icon. Right? I mean, there are entire generations of people now who grew up in a world where they never had that phone handset. Where never was it a thing that this sort of phone handset existed. So it doesn't mean anything to them in regard to call. Like it's culturally irrelevant. So that's another layer that we have to put in this. Not just that we're making something that multiple people can see and multiple people can use, but that we have this thing that multiple people can see, multiple people can use, and it makes sense to them. To put it in another bit of perspective, I think what I want you to do, and I'm really kind of ready to wrap this up. Like a lot of these lessons that we do in this course are more like workshop type stuff than it is like a standard lesson. But I'd like to kind of leave you with some final thoughts. And so I think I'll move into that portion now. Right, because one of them is what I'd like you to do this week as we keep going throughout the week and going on into next week. I'd like you to pay attention to this stuff. Pay attention to affordances and signifiers on the web. Pay attention to affordances and signifiers and feedback that you get in regular life. Just pay attention to it. Keep your eyes open. When you see something that is an affordance, that is a signifier, call it out in your head. And also, what I like to leave you all with, when we finish these, is I like to leave you all with a quote as well. So I have this quote here. That takes another look at the idea of affordances. And it's from a book called Designing Calm Technology by Mark Weiser and John C. Lee Brown. And I think just based on the title of the book alone, Designing Calm Technology, that's kind of elucidating some thought out of me. Because really what we're talking about when we're talking about web design in the manner that we're talking about web design is such a thing, right? We're designing calm technology. Something that... Because, like, what is the opposite of calm? The opposite of calm is chaos. Right? And what happens when a website is chaotic? Right? If you're trying to make a purchase on a website that's chaotic, it places those barriers to get you from what you want, or from where you're at to what you want, right? So really there is a lot to this idea of kind of calming down the technology by using these psychological methods to approach our design. When you're doing things right, nobody will know you're doing anything at all. But Mark Weiser and John C. Lee Brown, in their book Designing Calm Technology, said this about an affordance, just to give you a bit of a different perspective as we wrap up. An affordance is a relationship between an object in the world and the intentions, perceptions, and capabilities of a person. The side of a door that only pushes out affords this action by offering a flat push plate. Where have we seen that? The idea of affordance, powerful as it is, tends to describe the surface of design. For us, the term affordance does not reach far enough into the periphery, where a design must be attuned, but not attended to. Remember what I said back at the start of this presentation. Our affordances, our signifiers, our feedback. It's not the end of visual interaction, of this interaction design, of web design. Right? And they put that here beautifully, right? As powerful as the affordance is, it doesn't reach far enough to be where a design must be attuned but not attended to, right? And that attuned but not attended to is great. That's that whole thing of saying, like I just said, when you're doing things right, it doesn't seem like you're doing them at all, right? They're attuned, but they're not, attenuation, right? Let's define that term, attenuation. The reduction of force, effect. In this case, the idea is the reduction of force. Right? We're talking about attenuation, the reduction of force or the reduction of impact. Right? When we take this design and we want to reduce how much force we're using, we want to attune this. We want to reduce the force. We want to make it seem more natural, more fluid. The affordances are a good start. But we have to do more, right? That's why we talk about this early on. Remember, way back in the beginning, we called these the foundations of interaction. This is our starting point. In order to get into that place where everything is natural, there are other things that we must consider, and that's why there are still a bunch of modules left in this course. So with that being said, I think that's a good place for us to wrap up here. Again, please get in touch with me if you have any questions. You've got your Module 3 assignments, which I believe are due next week on Sunday. We'll hang out in the chat for just a minute, just in case anybody here watching live with me has any questions. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.